about a number of the technologies that we've been developing related to global health and the environment for the most part. And I'll talk about them in the context of a couple of projects that we're doing on the ground. And the first one is with cookstoves. And what I'll talk about is the connection between cooking and global warming and climate change, which may not be immediately obvious. But it's in connection with this project called Project Surya, which is looking to really measure what is the connection between how about half the planet cooks right now and global warming. So right now, the way that half the planet does cook, about 3 billion people, is they use traditional fuels, firewood, dung, crop residues, whatever sort of locally available and primarily free. And they burn these in open fires. And the smoke from these fires is extremely toxic for people's health. And this has been known for some decades now. And what the main reason that people do this, of course, is the fuels are free and it's convenient, and this is really the main energy source that people have access to. But it's thought that actually smoke from the cooking fires, as well as the lighting and heating that people do indoors, kills 1 to 2 million people annually. And this is actually a pretty significant amount. It's comparable with, I think, malaria even, and is up there in terms of like the 4th global burden of disease. So it's a major issue. But the other thing that's only recently come to light is that the smoke also from these stoves and the lighting actually escapes outdoors. And the pollutants in this smoke have recently been found actually to be significant agents of climate change. So black carbon is one of the primary pollutants and is thought to be perhaps the second largest contributor after carbon dioxide to global warming. In addition, black carbon settles on glaciers and absorbs heat and actually causes the glaciers to melt at a significantly faster rate. And also some of the other pollutants in the smoke have been shown to cause millions of dollars of damage to crops and change rainfall. So the smoke actually from these 3 billion fires that burn every day around the world are actually thought to have some pretty far-reaching consequences. But because black carbon and some of these other pollutants have only more recently been understood as being climate change agents, nobody's really understood yet what is the direct connection between cooking and what is the actual measurable climate change that they might be causing. And so that is the goal of Project Surya, this very interdisciplinary, multi-centered project that I've been working with, which aims to take a 15 kilometer by 15 kilometer square area, which would be about 15,000 households roughly, and completely change how people are cooking, burning fuel, so cooking, lighting, and heating their homes. And then the goal here is to measure on the ground what are the reductions in emissions of black carbon and some of these other pollutants from each household, and then measure from the sky what are the changes both to the atmospheric concentrations of these pollutants as well as what are the actual changes in solar energy absorption or heating. And so the way that the project intends to do it is to take one area, which would be the control area, where no intervention would happen, and then take another neighboring area where the technologies would be clean cooking and clean burning technologies would be introduced in every household, and then measure from the sky, this from satellites, both areas in order to better understand what are the impacts on climate. But, and this is actually the project that we are working on with Mark and Subrendu. Excuse me, and there's multiple components of this project that unfortunately we don't have time to get into, but the idea really is to be able to measure on a granular level what's happening on the ground. And so in order to do this, we need to be able to collect data on black carbon on the ground on the scale of at least several thousand households in order to have a good understanding of what's happening. And by that I mean both what is the reduction in emissions and are people even switching to these new technologies, because one of the main issues here is that the cleaner cook stoves and the lanterns, they are reduce emissions of the pollutants, but they're not always as convenient to use, and there's lots of details around that. But what ends up happening is that often these clean technologies sit in the corner, and people go back to the mud stoves because those provide a lot of the other functional benefits that people need. And so what our aim is to be able to measure in a statistically significant way what are the reductions in emissions and are people using these new technologies. And the thing is that this is not easy to do, and partially because traditional instruments, and this is, to give you an idea, this is what our instrument room looked like a couple of years ago in Kairatspur. So we've got an ethylometer, we have a couple of other instruments, laptops, and what I'm not showing you here is the 20 or so motorcycle 12-volt batteries that we have sitting in the back, powered by an even much larger solar array. So this is not sustainable if we really want to take measurements on a house-by-house basis, which is what's needed. And I was actually having an interesting conversation with Alex from the Public Policy School about this. One of the sort of newer ideas in data collection is that these instruments provide you high-quality, very frequent measurements. But one of the things is that you can't get them in a lot of locations. So what are the trade-offs when you start thinking about getting lots of data from lots of locations that are not as accurate? And you know, what does that look like? But we don't really know yet because there haven't been a lot of studies that have tried to do this in a large-scale way. And so this is what we want to be able to do is have a couple of instrument towers which are equipped with this kind of extensive instrumentation, which require a lot of power, are very expensive. Like the ethylometer is about $20,000. But we have a couple of locations of this. But then we have about 2,000 sensors in houses that would collect more of the noisier but wider scale data. So in order to do that, we set out to design a low-cost sensor. And so we started from scratch to start looking at, well, how can black carbon be measured that doesn't require the lasers, the optics, and a lot of the other more complicated instrumentation that's required in the ethylometer. And so before I tell you how we did it, I'm just going to jump to this next picture. And it's honestly just because I like the picture. But so we all know mobile phones are everywhere. And of course the Swami who is using a mobile phone is so corrupt that he's also smoking. So, take it for what you will. But, mobile phones are everywhere. So I think it's, and, apologies if I get these statistics wrong. I shouldn't be trying this with global health people. But I think it's that 1 billion people right now don't have access to clean water. I think it's 2.5 billion people don't have access to clean toilets. But we now think that if there's about 5 billion mobile phones out there, do 5 billion people have access to a phone? That's questionable, but probably it's thought that more people have access to a mobile phone than have access to clean toilets. So mobile phones are everywhere. So this was an obvious choice for us. But we wanted to really rethink how mobile phones are used, because we all know about the community health worker scenario who uses the mobile phone to organize their data, call back, check in, really powerful, really sort of game-changing uses of the technology. But we were thinking a little differently about what else could we do with the mobile phone now that that scenario has been demonstrated. So going back to the black carbon then, what we started finding when we collected lots and lots of samples of black carbon was that the more black carbon you had on a filter, the darker the filter got. So you can just see sort of, this is a range of black carbon, or filters that have been exposed to black carbon. And so the other thing, well, let me back up. So one of the other ways that you can measure black carbon is you can expose it on a filter. So you have a small pump, pushes air through the filter, you get the black carbon that collects on it. And then one of the traditional methods to measure is that you send it to a lab, which will charge you about $50 a sample, to essentially burn this filter at very high temperatures and measure various characteristics of the filter in order to figure out exactly how much black carbon is on that filter. And let me also pause and just say that in this field, there's lots of different terms for black carbon. There's elemental carbon, and there's all sorts of complexities in this that I'm not going to get into right now, just for lack of time and to stay focused on this. But it is something that I'm happy to talk more about if anybody's curious. So anyways, black carbon filters cost about $50 to analyze the filter. But what we noticed was that the color actually differs. And so then we wondered, okay, well, how closely does the color actually correlate with the amount of black carbon that's on the filter? So we just ran these through a standard photo scanner, like an Epson photo scanner. And we just scanned the filters in and we took the image and then we measured the color from the image. So the closest we could get to color was we can, the way the images are represented is in red, blue, and green. So we just extracted the amount of red, blue, and green from each of these filters. And so we plotted red. And so what this is black carbon loading, which is how much black carbon, the weight of black carbon that's on there. And then we plotted the red on the x-axis. And so essentially what this is looking at absorption of light. So this is using spectroscopy essentially, but it's using a different approach to spectroscopy because normally spectroscopy relies on looking at individual wavelength absorption, but we couldn't get that because we were using a picture. So here's where you start getting into those trade-offs of accurate instrument, very expensive. Okay, well we have to make some trade-offs. So we look at absorption in a range of wavelengths from about 620 to 740 nanometers, which is what's represented by red. And we found really good correlation actually. So I forget the R squared on here, but it was like 0.98 or something. So really good correlation between color and black carbon. So we were able to leverage this observation and say, okay, if the color so closely corresponds, one way that you can analyze these filters, of course, is to scan them in through a scanner. But that's still kind of a pain and all of that. So the other thing we wondered is, what if you take a picture of this, and can you analyze the picture in a way that's A, automatic, and B, accurate enough? And so,
just out of curiosity,
yeah,
so on the blue and green, what was the correlation?
Of course. Well, so blue, okay, there's a couple things to say about that. Green was not good. So backing up, what sort of traditional instruments say, like the ethylometer, for example, which is one of the longer standing ones, is that black carbon it most closely corresponds to absorption of the 880 nanometer, which is infrared, near infrared, and you can't get that in the visible spectrum. So we picked the wavelength that was closest to 880, which was red. But that being said, so green we didn't find as good a correlation. There was some, it was noisy, we didn't bother looking into it too much. Blue, there was potentially correlation, again we didn't look into it too much, but one of the things that we want to do is that organic carbon, which is, so when you talk about total carbon, you have black carbon, which is largely the absorbing, heat absorbing, and then you have organic carbon, which is the scattering, and potentially cools. So there's these sort of trade-offs and impacts. But organic carbon actually primarily absorbs in the blue and ultraviolet wavelengths. So what we're hoping to see is, once we have time to do the analysis, is can we actually determine organic carbon composition by looking at absorption in the blue? So, so not yet, but hopefully this year. But okay, so we then developed this color chart, and I took this picture really quickly last night, so it's sort of bizarre, but you take a picture, you put your filter right on the color chart, you take a picture of it, and then you just email it to our servers. And actually I have everything here, so if anybody wants to do it after, you can just take a picture and email it. And you get a response in a couple of minutes, which tells you what is the atmospheric concentration that corresponds with this filter. So the things that the server needs to know in order to figure that out is how fast was the air flowing through the filter, and how long was the filter exposed. So that's how it translates amount of black carbon on the filter to atmospheric black carbon. And in order to get at the amount of black carbon here, the algorithm takes the picture. Because it knows to look for the reference chart, it sort of has some landmarks to look for. So it identifies some aspects of the picture. It finds the filter using standard sort of off-the-shelf techniques. It then samples the color from this. And then in order to figure out what that color means, because of course cameras are all different, lighting conditions are different, we have this color chart here. So it samples each of the squares of the color chart, recreates our calibration curve, and figures out how much black carbon is there based on the color. So, I don't know if
So you're taking a picture of the filter and what else?
of this color chart that we
The
developed.
color chart.
Yeah, I'll just pull it out right now really quickly. So this is the chart.
Oh, I see.
So it's small, we print it out, and then it's
So you
placed
place a
here.
filter on that white
So
cell.
you place, yeah, the filter on that, and then you take a picture of it.
What about dust?
Yeah,
Or
The things you worry about.
dust is, you know, and actually,
Heat.
I worry about dust in two ways. I worry about dust both gathering on this filter. We don't have a good answer for that yet, because you know, once you start trying to laminate, you get like glare and reflection on the picture. So I don't have a good answer for that. And then the second thing, I'm sorry to go back. One thing we do think is we need to start doing some other types of calibration. Like we should look to make sure how close this is to white. Like if it's not close enough, then well, maybe it is dusty and something else needs to happen. That's pretty easy to do. I'm not sure if that's gonna work. The other thing I worry about with dust is actually contaminating the sample itself, because dust will absorb light as well. So I don't have a good answer for that. So yeah, but it is on our minds. Any other questions? Okay, so, oh yeah, okay, so this was some validation that we did just sort of across a large spectrum of readings from almost near 1,000 micrograms per meter cubed to like 0.1 micrograms. This is my house down here at like, 0.01 micrograms per meter cubed. And this is India. So, many, many orders of magnitude difference. And I live in LA, by the way, so that gives you an idea. And in LA, you mostly get like 0.1 micrograms per meter cubed if you go into very populated, dense areas. But in India, we were getting 500, 1,000, up to 1,000 micrograms per meter cubed. So much higher. It's probably like, putting your mouth literally on a diesel truck and sucking deeply. So, okay, so we deployed this in the field. We have 4 sensors out there right now. And so data's coming in from the field. Our field partner at the Energy Resources Institute, Terry, has an office in a village called Karatpur in the state of Uttar Pradesh in East India. And so they've been collecting data, and they've started now training the women who live in the houses to collect the data as well. And so this is actually a picture of Shabnam, who's she lives in the village, but has been working with Terry for a while. So she's a very sort of what they call a committed, trained volunteer. But they're also starting to work with some of the other women who are less involved with the project, but invested enough that they will change the filters and take pictures. So now we're at the point of saying we're reasonably confident in the technology. We also did the study with the Environmental Protection Agency to validate it with 600 of their filters as well. So where they just sent us the pictures and we sent them back results, and they kind of looked at how well it worked. So we're reasonably confident in the technology. But we want to now start dealing with the other 90% of the problem, which is, okay, what happens when you try to use it in the field? And so that's where we're at right now, just through lots and lots of deployments, tweaking, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And so this is, I didn't have time to actually analyze more of the data. We probably have now, I don't know, 300-400 samples from the last 3 months, but which I sadly have not analyzed. But anyways, this was 1 week of data that I analyzed from just December 30th of last year. And it's just 4 houses, and it's just 1 week, and so many things happened. So you can't draw anything from this, but what this data set tells us is that there's a lot of variation. Even when you have, this is one house, so if you follow this yellow curve, this is a mud stove used in one house. And you see that there's a ton of variation. And that really high point right there, is that an error? Is it something really abnormal happened that day? We don't know, but what this tells us is that it is really important to be collecting this house by house data, and we need it across hundreds and hundreds of households to really start understanding all the dynamics that contribute to it. The ventilation of the kitchen, the performance of the stove, has the stove been recently maintained? There's many reasons why you're going to get different readings. So,
Are these 24-hour samples?
no, these are the samplers run just during cooking times. And so it's an integrated sample. So this is one of the areas where our instrument is much simpler, doesn't provide as much data, in that we're not going to be able to provide minute by minute or even 30-minute readings. It's going to be a couple of hours that it's aggregated over. And whereas like the ethylometer will give you readings every 5 minutes. There's lots and lots of trade-offs between the two that I can talk about more, but that's one of them. Yeah, so this is actually, each of these represents about 3 hours, which is about how long the cooking takes. And so each day we'll have 2 samples, the morning cooking and the evening cooking.
Actually, you still need I guess, a well-calibrated flow system. You need to understand the flow through the filter pretty well. And the handling of the filter has to be very good. So I just wonder why the alternative of doing exactly what you're doing, but sending the filters back to your lab where you can take the pictures. Why did you decide to have them take the pictures?
Well, so you raise actually an important problem, and I think having them send back the filters would only make that problem more extreme. So I don't think that's the solution. But to address the first part of what you said, absolutely, the sampler itself does have to be pretty well calibrated. And so that's part of what we're doing field tests right now, is to make sure that when you have even really high loading on the filter, how much does it change the flow rate, and how is that going to change the measurements? If you have tubes that are a little bit longer so that we can get outdoor measurements, how does that change what we get? So yes, the sampler has to be really well calibrated.
So what is the issue with them sending back
But so why we have them, right, why we don't have them mail back, you're saying mail back the filters?
Yeah, do you take the picture?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One, we're not even doing, so right now we're doing this weird hybrid. So part of the reason why I haven't been able to analyze the data is because we're doing this hybrid right now where they take a picture of the filter, but then they have to write down what the duration was and what the flow rate was. And then I have to, anyways, messiness. And even that has been a logistical nightmare. So now if we imagine having them send back the filter and accurately index it with the associated 2 pieces of information we need and the date and time, it seems like a disaster. Whereas what we finally this week have moved to is that they can, in the field, take a picture, literally annotate it with the 2 pieces of information I need and email it. So once we do that, I don't have to do any analysis. Like, it's all in the database automatically. I can make that available in real time. So that's one reason why we have them do it. The second reason is also the filters are actually a little delicate. And so by the time they get properly stored, and in the field, I mean, I'm sure you know, it's just dusty and lots of stuff happens. So I'd rather risk just them taking it from the sampler, putting it down, taking a picture. Very little can happen there. By the time you get it into the proper envelope, you label the envelope, you put it in the mailbox, it's taken from Kharagpur to Lucknow to wherever. Who knows what's going to happen to the filters?
And can I ask do you think you're getting ambient aerosol concentrations? Are you getting some drying going on? What?
You're talking about the aging of the aerosol?
Just are you losing? As the filter paper, are you losing water as you're handling it?
Oh, losing water. I don't. What would that losing the water do?
There's a significant amount of water as mass of the aerosol.
Right. But what would that do to the reading?
Your reading would be lower than what it would be compared to what's really ambient in the ambient atmosphere.
Because the water is absorbing.
It's a significant component of the aerosol.
But we're not measuring mass.
You're doing
though.
mass concentration.
We're not measuring mass is the thing. We're just taking a picture, so we're just relying on absorption.
So you're just doing, so that micrograms per cubic meter is really black carbon micrograms.
Yes,
Okay.
it is. But the thing that I do worry about with aging is that aging does change the spectral characteristics of the aerosol. And so that's something I worry about more with organic carbon than black carbon. But, and I'm not an atmospheric scientist, by the way, I just try to read a lot of papers. But that's something that does concern me as well. But that's another reason, by the way, to do the immediate capture, because then you don't have to worry. Like, for example, with organic carbon, if you really want to get true organic carbon without worrying about the aging, you have to refrigerate the sample, not expose it to light. I don't trust that that will happen. I can't make that happen in my own backyard. I'm very terrible sample taker. So I just, yeah.
From a health effects standpoint, should one read more into the peaks or into the chronic exposure?
Oh yeah, that's a great question.
I'm just curious how you're thinking about the use of these data.
So we're working with a couple of different epidemiologists who have not, one of them is John Salmon at the USC Global Health Institute, and he has not gotten a chance to look at the data yet, but that's absolutely one of the things that I'm interested in. But yeah, I don't know. But another reason why being able to capture this kind of variation, we're pretty excited about.
So has the bottleneck been shifted from the processing of the filters to the creation of the filters? So is the bottleneck now the ability to generate
The samples?
The samples, yeah.
Yeah, especially because we're still in this iterative phase. And so right now what we're doing is, because we only have 4 samplers out there, because of course, until you get it right, you don't want to generate more. So there's this very labor-intensive process where people are, the field staff leave the samplers in 4 houses for about 7 days. And each day they have to go turn it on and off during the cooking, and yeah, and then they have to move the samplers, so it's very labor-intensive to get these samples. So yeah, that is a bottleneck. But we still haven't quite, the bottleneck is still the processing, because we have this 3 months of data that I have to go through, and I just haven't. But as of this week, hopefully, yes, we've shifted to filter creation.
That's another nice, this is a very
Please,
nice
I
question.
much prefer questions than to talk, so.
So is there any way you can get rid of the sampling at all? Like somebody hold a calibrated color curve at a certain distance and you take a picture, or is the
No, it's a very good
sensitivity
question.
just not there?
So Gaurav Sukakme at USC in engineering actually did some work on this in LA, where we clearly have an abundance of samples there. So he did something where he looked at visibility. Essentially what you're talking about is a visibility metric, and can you translate visibility into actual concentrations? I think the thing is, I don't know almost anything about visibility, but I think that there's many different components that impact visibility. It's not just black carbon. Definitely dust is a big impactor, and I'm sure there's others. Water probably. But anyway, but what he did show was that because visibility is an index in LA, at least for pollution, he showed that you could, if you took the same picture of a building, it had to be like a mile away, I think. If you could take the same picture of that building every day for a month, he showed that you could use the analysis of the building. It had to be at the same time, same building. You could use an analysis of how sort of bright the colors were or something of the building to closely correspond with the visibility metric. But going beyond that,
But at these very high concentrations, I wonder, by standing a certain distance with a color calibrated,
Right.
the kind of chart you have,
right,
and taking a picture and doing,
Yeah.
I just wonder if you can find anything.
yeah, based on my limited time in the kitchens, you can definitely see the smoke as it's coming from the stove, but I think the placement of the chart, all of that, would a lot of variability, I imagine. But yeah.
But you'd be standardizing that with the samplers, right? So we could standardize this, where exactly this, Prasad is going to stand there for a long time, 24 hours, holding up this board. But, I guess the sampling is standardized, so the picture taking could be
You don't have
standardized.
to hold it, so you can put it on the
Yeah, you put it on the
and
wall,
stuff
that's
now.
true. You can put it on the wall.
It's more fun that way.
But
Yeah.
I think the issue is going to be the environmental factors are much more at play. So then you start collecting information on dust and humidity and, who knows what else matters.
But you might
Probably
find
an
some
interesting
wavelength
study there.
somewhere where it calibrates
Absolutely.
well. That's
Yeah.
what you did. You found a wavelength where it
Yeah.
calibrated.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. How are we doing for time? 20 minutes. Okay. Let's keep looking at it. Okay, so I talked in detail about our black carbon sensor, but we have a number of different sensors. I'll just spend like a couple of minutes talking about some of the others that we do. And so this is actually what, we'll be using the black carbon sensor in our study with Mark and Subrendu, but we'll also be using this Cookstove usage sensor. And so what this is, we're pretty excited about this too. This is actually I brought this. And of course, like all demos, I found out this morning that this one does not work as I wanted it to. I haven't gotten a chance to figure out why, but sorry, Mark, cover your ears. But this will be used in the field. And what this is a temperature sensor, which is essentially a couple of resistors. And it's a thermistor which changes its resistance with temperature. And the idea here is that if we can measure temperature of the stove continuously, we can start looking at how much is the stove being used, and both within a day as well as over the course of time. And the challenge with this is that before it was pretty expensive to collect this data. There's another team led by Kirk Smith, for example, that has developed they were the first to develop the temperature sensor, and that ends up being a lot more expensive because it requires custom hardware, or it is just a data logger. This is like a specialized data logger that you have to buy, that you then have to go and visit the house every day or every month to collect the data. So we started wondering, how can we do this in a more remote way so that people could use most of the technologies that were more available. And so what we figured out is that actually a cell phone works really well as a data logger for certain types of sensors. And so what we figured out is that you can actually use the headset port on the cell phone, and that ends up, when the cell phone plays a sound, what it's doing is playing a voltage, which can be harvested for power. So it's like a mini power source that you can plug a sensor into. And the other thing is that when the cell phone records sound, it actually is translating the analog signal to a digital signal that the computer can understand. And that's what you need for a number of sensors, is an ADC. So we figured out that when you have this additional small extra board, and this literally is a couple of resistors and capacitors, and then you have this thermistor, which these should plug together, they don't, I'm very sorry about that. Oops, over here, board, sensor, plug this into the headset port, so this is just a standard headset jack. So we have a little bit of software, not much, that runs on here that's essentially just playing sound and recording sound. So it's pretty simple software, and that will get us temperature data, which we then can upload. So that's great because these are just bought off the shelf mostly. That's not totally true because we needed to make this robust for a Cookstove, blah, blah, blah. But the components itself cost like pennies. So it's a question of getting these manufactured at even like 500 or 1,000, and they'll become a lot cheaper. You can start collecting temperature data and then use this data in order to understand how much people are cooking. So what are the drawbacks of this approach? Because there always are drawbacks. One of them is that this doesn't have any data storage on it on its own. So in order to actually get data, you have to plug it into a cell phone. So this means that if somebody's talking on their phone, they can't be recording temperature data. It also means that if they forget to plug the phone into the sensor, you're also not going to get temperature data. And so it's a question of figuring out a lot of that non-trivial problems in the field, but for at least a smaller scale study, we provide financial incentives, something that sort of encourages people to remember every time to plug their phone in. And at least in Kharagpur, where we've been working with Terry, what the women there that Terry's been working with have said is that they feel like they can manage this much. And especially if they get access to the phone in the non-cooking times, they can call, text, whatever it is. People are pretty incentivized for now. But it's something that we'll be continuing to explore. But so what we found is that this is just a little bit of data collected in the field over the last couple of months. This is a temperature profile from one cooking event with a mud stove. So you can see it starts around like 40 degrees Celsius. No, sorry, that's wrong. Maybe 30 degrees Celsius. And then starts getting hotter, pretty noisy. Similarly, another mud stove. And then this is what a clean cook stove, one of the clean cook stoves looks like, where the sensor is attached there, and you get a much cleaner, much faster rise, much flatter because the temperature sensor just saturates, but sort of cleaner curve, faster heating up. And so what we're starting to explore is, do these stoves have different enough characteristics that we can automatically, with a simple statistical algorithm, figure out not only how long is the cooking happening, but what type of stove is being used, and possibly even what type of fuel. And so that's what we're going to be starting to explore right now, and all based on the characteristics of the temperature profile. So one of the things we're also starting to explore is, how can we sort of think about this longer term beyond the study? And so, for example, Terry's starting to work with local entrepreneurs to make their stove available. Anyways, to make a clean cook stove available in markets, but of course very few people are buying these right now because they're not yet that affordable. They're still, I think, like $50 US approximately. So one of the things we started looking at is carbon credits, which, caveats and all of that, but we're starting to look at, can it make sense to apply carbon credits or some type of carbon-based financing for cook stoves? And where this ties back into Project Surya and the sensors is that, could there be carbon-based financing for reductions in black carbon, which right now there aren't. Right now it's all about carbon dioxide. And so Surya is looking to quantify the reductions in black carbon to possibly inform that kind of a thing. And then if you couple it with this cook stove usage sensor that shows how much are people actually cooking, and ideally how much are they then reducing their black carbon, could you then use this data to provide a validated carbon credit And could the cell phone then serve as both providing validation data as well as a mechanism for directly transferring incentives, financial sort of trades for the usage of the Cookstove? So it's something that we're starting to think about and explore. Okay, so I'll mention a couple of other technologies we're working on. One is cold chain monitoring. So using, again, the temperature sensor, though a slightly different one that is calibrated for colder environments, we're looking at how can we use this technology, again, to provide low-cost monitoring for the transfer of vaccines and medicines that are extremely temperature sensitive. Because this has been actually one of the biggest issues, one of the big issues for medication distribution. Is making sure that the vaccines and medicines are stored at the right temperature so that we know that they're effective when they get there. So the other thing we've been looking at is, and I apologize, this is actually not the real picture, I grabbed this from the internet, but we've started looking at, can you do jaundice diagnosis, again using the coarse spectral absorption technique that we developed for black carbon. Because in our initial analysis, what we found is that blood spots with different levels of bilirubin do have different colors or different spectral characteristics. So we're trying to figure out if we can use, again, the image analysis with the color chart to provide a lower cost diagnostic for jaundice. We're also starting with our partner to look at, can you use it to analyze skin tone in order to do a non-invasive diagnosis of jaundice? That's much more exploratory, but also something we are starting to look at.
Is the sclera not better than
Sorry, what's that?
is not the sclera better than skin tone as a measure for
Oh,
jaundice?
they had mentioned that as well. So yes, that is something that we were just going to collect a bunch of samples of both the eye as well as the skin to see. I'm really, really skeptical, honestly. I just, not just pigment issues, but just, once you start trying to photograph the body and determine something quantitatively, I'm not sure, but we're gonna look at that. I was just starting to look at Nithya Ramanathan's work with the spectral characteristics of the cervical cancer cells that she's done, where she's shown a lot of spectral variants. So she's using light-based techniques as well for low-cost diagnostic, and that's something where it's not, that seems possibly much more doable because she has these samples on these white backgrounds or something that she can then do the analysis on. But doing it even on the eye, you have all the background glare and I don't know, but we're exploring it. So the other thing we're doing with some partners is they're providing low-cost phototherapy lights for jaundice treatment, and one of the issues that they've found is that I think in 90% of their hospitals that they've been deploying to, the lights are actually not working. And unfortunately, the lights don't change visibly, but the intensity of the lights, once they get below a certain level, do not provide the treatment that's needed. And so we're looking to provide a low-cost diagnostic, again, using some form of spectral variants, taking a picture either of the lights or putting a chart below the lights and taking a picture of that to see if we can start figuring out very quickly when lights are no longer working. And this is just an area not in global health that I just thought I'd mention because it's kind of fun, is that over the last 2 years, we've been working with conservationists who do work on remote islands to preserve seabird species. Because it turns out that seabird species are in this sort of important area in the food chain where as they go extinct, it's going to impact lots and lots of other species. And so they focus on seabirds. And they want to know how well their efforts are working. And so we've developed a cell phone that sits in a small pelican box and records audio signals. And we're slowly starting to develop the algorithms to translate the audio signals into bird calls so that ideally, if you put the boxes in the right place where nesting season happens, you can really actually figure out how the populations are changing over time. And so I'll end with this, which is that we tend to use mobile phones because they are off the shelf. They're low cost, everybody knows how to use them, everybody wants to use one. So they end up being this really convenient tool. But we try to use them in sort of newer ways than have previously been done, where we look at how can we leverage what's on the phone with perhaps very low cost additional devices to really start capturing data that wasn't previously possible before in a very low cost way. And when I say low cost, we're aiming for $10, $15, $100, that target. And one of the things that we think could really change how things are done is that because these phones are wireless, it's not always necessary to have the wireless access to the data in the individual case, but it makes it possible now to very easily aggregate data in many locations. So you start getting individual, local, district, regional, and ideally global scale monitoring of issues that really can then help us start rethinking how we allocate resources and address these sort of larger scale problems. So that's a lot of what we think about, and we've deployed in a number of countries over the last, we just started 2 years ago, more or less, and we have a number of different funders and partners, and that's us. There's 3 of us sort of main people who are part of this NGO, and we have 4 or 5 other sort of part-time contractors, people who contribute. So that's about it.
I guess the strategic question here in terms of thinking of this as a mechanism to get this information is what you've said initially, right? There's 5 billion phones. So all of a sudden we have a gadget that's in places that typical scientists aren't being able to get to. On the other hand, if it's always conditional on a sampler, now there aren't 5 billion samplers, right? And there aren't
Absolutely.
5 billion jaundice record screens or something, but
No, absolutely. Well,
so I think I think then it becomes constrained by the user's ability to understand what is it that you want to do. So all these,
yeah,
and
that's totally true.
Is there a different set of things that we should be thinking about that those guys have in their day-to-day lives, like taking pictures of the trees and
So
species?
there's a whole area of work now that actually my thesis advisor, Deborah Estrin, mostly got started, called participatory sensing. So the idea here is citizen science
Right.
with mobile phones.
Right.
And so absolutely, there's, take a picture of the pothole, take a picture of the trees, take a picture of your neighborhood, take a picture of the food you're eating. I'm sort of involved in this craze as well. It's very tempting, and I think it has potential. There has not been, as far as I can say, a really convincing case of how it's changed what people know about something. So we know that, for example, one study that I'm running, we know that low-income overweight moms eat crappy food, and now we've documented it. Well, it had been documented before, and we already knew that. So there's a lot of cases like that. I don't mean to be dismissive at all, and I'm absolutely part of some of this work. I'd say some of the more maybe larger scale compelling cases has been with Ushahidi, which is a SMS-based platform. So SMS crowdsourcing is the other term that is largely used. And they have shown some potentially interesting results where when people are able to all send an SMS message to a central system and you can see that data mapped, it helps people figure out, for example, with Haiti and the earthquake, it helped some people get access to help that may not have otherwise gotten access to it. And so I think Ushahidi is definitely one of the best examples of what you're talking about, where if I just have my cell phone and I want to document something in my everyday life, they are really making that possible. So that's absolutely. And then I think the other thing is, if once you start talking about the smartphones for the community health workers, for example, that's another really well documented scenario where people are using their everyday phones for the most part and really collecting data that's totally changing how community health workers are able to serve their patient populations. And there's something called ComCare, there's another thing called Open Data Kit. So there's software bases to support that kind of a usage.
Yeah,
not really answering your question,
more
but
along
I think
the lines
you're right.
of,
I mean, what we're talking about here is definitely, we're not aiming for that crowdsourcing 5 billion people. We're more saying, when I bring up the 5 billion phone number, it's more just to say that phones are everywhere. So if you do want to collect this kind of data, in theory, you don't need to provide the
Right.
actual phone itself. You can provide these very low-cost peripherals and get the kind of data that wasn't possible before. But absolutely, it's not going to ever be at the 5 billion target where everybody has a sampler. But we don't need that kind of data either.
Well, yeah, so I guess the discussion is just as much as everybody's thinking about the phone, we should be thinking about that other thing that's needed, that more citizen scientists can sort of contribute to. I'm not thinking about 5 billion either. It's more along the lines of Prasad's question. If it's a screen that's sort of
Right.
behind the
No, absolutely.
So
Absolutely, that would be amazing.
then we don't need the, because the
Yes.
sampler is $5,000 and it's, you know,
500, but
right.
still not affordable, and it's
Right.
still a little delicate, honestly.
Right,
Like
right.
it's, you know, you can't really throw it around.
Right.
Yeah, no, we're not where we need to be at all. And so when you can get to that piece of paper on a wall to get actual air pollution reading, that will be awesome. Absolutely. Or taking a picture of a baby and figuring
Right.
out their jaundice or their
That's right.
anemia, or
That's right.
that's absolutely where we need to be. But it's also, sorry, I'll say one other thing, which is that I am an optimist but a pragmatist also, and that I get really excited to think about those applications, but I also am sort of, don't want us as a sort of whatever group to get carried away in thinking that that's gonna work right now. So I do tend to be a little bit more on the skeptical side, because everybody right now is like, mobile phones, yay! But it doesn't work. It doesn't make a difference in a lot of cases, and it's not always needed. But because the funders are out there funding mobile phones for everything, you know, we tend to want to integrate it for everything. So, anyways, but absolutely we want to be there. Sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. 2 questions. First of all, what sort of standardization or accounting has taken place when you're looking at ambient light in different settings and also time of day, weather conditions, or taking pictures of these filters? And then 2, what sort of accounting has taken place or differences have you seen with bandwidth compression on busy networks? And does it alter the quality of the photo when you're looking at tones of brown to black?
Sure.
And do you see internetwork variability, things like that? And also documenting for even the type of flash on the phone that's used between
Right.
types of phones.
Well, so there's a lot to say in that we are just starting to really try to get into that in a very real way. So, before we tried like 5 different phones in a lab and, everything was great. But yeah, in the field where, some of the field staff are literally pulling out their 3-year-old Nokias and taking a picture and emailing it to us, it's honestly not working that well. I actually don't think it's the image compression. I think it's tends to be more like, Lokendra's phone had a flash on it, and that totally just screws it up. So flashes, no, that's bad. And so, okay, so now we go back and we say, all right, well, how do we figure out when there's a flash? Well, it's actually not that hard because the lighting just on this black area is totally different. Like, you've got all these like white splotches and some other darker splotches. So actually we're coming up with a glare detection algorithm now that will say, sorry, you have glare, so turn off your flash or your, your whatever light bulb that's pointing at this. But there's going to be lots of things that keep coming up. Yeah, it's going to keep needing refinement like that.
Thank you.
Can you talk about some of your water applications?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I didn't get a chance to put this in. This is a problem with doing your talk at 3 in the morning. So, 2 things. What I did in Bangladesh with arsenic was actually with something totally different, but I'll mention it briefly because it kind of got me to where I'm at today, which is that I felt in some ways it was a success, but in some ways it was a total failure. So my thesis work was in developing these low-power wireless radios that were about this big that could, I didn't develop the radios, those had been developed by a research group at Berkeley, but to connect those to groundwater sensors so that we could start collecting data every 5 minutes or 10 minutes in order to better understand the conditions that could cause arsenic mobilization in the groundwater in Bangladesh. And we were working in one area outside of Dhaka that had like 30 times what the WHO's recommendation was for acceptable arsenic levels. And we couldn't measure arsenic directly because there was no available sensor, but we could measure some of the other elements that were considered to be a proxy for arsenic. And so we collected lots and lots of data, and we showed that actually there were, anyways, I won't get into all that, but so we uncovered some potentially interesting things in the water chemistry that could have contributed to arsenic mobilization, but it cost like $150,000. And it needed me to be there babysitting it every second to like literally coax data out of this thing. So I got an important lesson from that, which is that these custom solutions, custom hardware solutions, are possibly good in some ways, but are never going to scale to the level that we want them to, and never going to be robust in that way that we want them to actually work in the field, which is really what brought me to work with mobile phones as a data collection device, because mobile phones are just, I mean, how many millions of people have field tested this phone for me so that I never have to worry about dealing with all sorts of things breaking. It's great. It's really awesome. So in terms of thinking of it like a data logger, they're actually these really wonderful data loggers because they're so robust. But so now we're actually working with one group that has developed this low-cost E. coli test, and it's based on, I don't understand it well enough actually to describe it, which is partly why I didn't put it in here. But the result is a piece of paper that comes up with lots of different clusters of E. coli that have been cultured. And so we can take a picture of that and then count the clusters in the picture automatically so that you can start getting some more reliable counts of the E. coli in water samples. So that's one of the things that we're thinking about. But there's so many things that actually are possible in water that I would love to explore, that are both color-based tests, but also other types of sensors that we can start collecting data from. And once you can start connecting them to the cell phone, you can really start sort of systematizing how the data is understood and looked at. So yeah.
And when how do you combine the data together?
Sorry, could you say that one more time? There's just some noise here.
And how do you combine the data together? When you use all the mobile cell phones, like for example, how do you find the data?
So you're saying from many different mobile phones, how do we get the data combined so we can analyze it in the same? So, well, the ways that we ask people to collect it are standardized, and this actually gets a little bit to your question, in that we ask people to provide the duration and the pump flow rate in the sort of standard format that a computer can automatically recognize. And so then it just becomes a question of people, it doesn't matter what types of phones, for the most part, people are emailing the pictures, and all the pictures get collected in our centralized database. And then, because they just send an email, so the picture is sent to our Gmail account, then we have a server process that's monitoring that Gmail account and grabs the pictures, parses out the picture and the information that's provided with it, and then extracts the black carbon data and then stores it in a database. And so one of the nice things about that is that you don't have to worry about data formats and data cleaning and stuff, which ends up taking me hundreds of hours to deal with. So it's sort of convenient that way. You get like a single format that you can analyze, even though the data is from many different locations. And then in terms of figuring out, maybe also what you're asking is like different locations. Each of these charts is encoded. So this is essentially a two-dimensional barcode right here, and so it's encoded with a unique ID. And so when somebody takes a picture, I don't know where the location is, but at least I know this ID. And so there is some organization that's needed there to keep the charts associated with the specific house.
So maybe you might be taking any daily logs and what corresponds to some of these peaks in what you're detecting. Because January 1st, I noticed on
Right.
that particular thing, and I just can't help but thinking that the feast that might be unfolding in some places in a bigger household might be very different in terms of
Totally.
what you see.
Yeah, so as part of the field collection, there are field logs, and part of it is documenting any sort of abnormal things that occurred, both like, did it rain, because outdoor conditions could potentially impact indoor conditions, and was it like cooking something specifically different that day or something else that might impact it. So yeah, we are keeping logs. How good they are, that's always, you know, it's as good as the data collector. But yeah, I need to go sort through all that. Okay, great. Well, don't hesitate to email me if you have any follow-up questions or anything.